Okay, so this time you've really outdone yourself with the research materials.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, like I'm looking at timelines going back thousands of years and trying to figure out what a single word like Palestine really means.
Right.
Trying to wrap my head around how an entire people see themselves.
Mm.
And then you throw in this conflict that never seems to end.
Yeah.
It's
It's a lot.
a lot to process.
It is.
Right.
For this deep dive, though, that's exactly what we are going to try to do for everyone listening.
Right.
Sort through all of this information and find the key takeaways.
Yeah.
Trying to give you a clearer picture of this really complex part of the world
Mm-hmm.
without overwhelming you.
Yeah, think of us as like your guides.
Yeah.
Through this massive history project.
Exactly.
Okay, so I think the best place to start is the name itself,
Okay.
Palestine.
Makes sense.
Where did that name even come from and what makes it so complicated?
Okay, so the name Palestine, it goes way back to the Philistines who settled along the coast around the 12th century BCE.
BCE, okay.
And different ancient cultures had their own names for them.
Oh, interesting.
So in Egyptian records, they're called the Purusati.
Okay.
Assyrian inscriptions use Palastu.
So similar.
Similar, yeah, and even in the Hebrew Bible,
Oh, wow.
they're called the Pelishit.
That's fascinating.
So the connection between this land and the Philistines is ancient.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the name was already spreading even beyond just those immediate neighbors.
Yeah.
You know, we see Greek writers like Herodotus
Right.
using Palestine in the 5th century BCE,
Mm-hmm.
and he's talking about a much larger area than just that little Philistine coast.
Exactly. So the name is already expanding.
So it already has this broader meaning.
Yeah, and then it gets even more interesting when the Romans come in
Okay.
in the 2nd century CE.
Okay.
After the Bar Kokhba revolt,
Okay.
they decide to rename Judea,
Okay.
and they call it Syria-Palestina.
Syria-Palestina.
And a lot of historians think this was a deliberate move to kind of weaken the Jewish connection to the land.
Almost like saying,
Yeah.
this isn't yours.
Right, because they had just put down these uprisings.
Right.
And so they're trying to diminish that Jewish identity
I see.
and instead connect it to these Philistines who by this point weren't really a major power.
Right, right.
So it's fascinating to see how a name can be used for political purposes.
It's almost like historical erasure.
It is.
And then the name sticks around.
Yeah, it does.
Because then the Byzantines come along and they're using Palestine
Mm-hmm.
for their provinces.
Exactly.
They divide it up into Palestina, Prima Secunda, and Tertia.
Right?
So for centuries, it's this official term.
An official geographical designation.
Right.
And then the Muslims conquer the region in the 7th century.
Okay.
And they use the Arabic term Philistine for one of their military districts.
I see.
So through all these empires and changes,
Mm-hmm.
some form of Palestine continues to be used.
Right. But then things get a little murky when we get to the Ottomans.
Right, because under the Ottomans, Palestine wasn't an official administrative unit. It was
Okay.
more of an informal term,
I see.
especially used by Europeans when they're talking about the Holy Land.
Okay.
Locally, it was sometimes called Surya al-Janubiyya,
Surya Janubiyya.
meaning southern Syria.
Okay, so two very different names depending on who you're talking to.
Exactly. And it's interesting how the Europeans seem to prefer Palestine, even though it wasn't official.
Yeah. What do you think that says about their perspective on the region?
Well, it could be that they were drawing on these older historical associations with the name.
Like the Romans and the Byzantines?
Exactly.
Or maybe even further back to the Greeks.
Maybe they saw it as a more neutral term
That's interesting.
than southern Syria, which kind of implies it's just an extension of Syria.
Right, right.
So it could be about emphasizing the distinctness of the region.
Okay.
But whatever the reason, the name Palestine had the staying power.
It did.
And then in the 20th century, it becomes official again.
Right, under the British mandate.
Exactly. And Arabic speakers continue to use Palestine.
But it wasn't a name that everyone embraced, was it?
No, it wasn't. You're right.
The Jewish communities preferred Eretz Israel,
Right. The land of Israel.
highlighting their own connection to the land.
Exactly.
And maybe even pushing back against that Roman renaming from all those centuries ago.
Yeah, it's almost like they're reclaiming the name.
It's fascinating how a name can become a battleground.
It really is.
So we've got this contested name, and then we've got the people who live there,
Yeah,
and their identity is just as complex.
it is.
So the Palestinians are primarily Arab,
Right. Ethno-nationally Arab.
and they trace their roots back to the ancient Levant,
Mm.
including the Canaanites.
Yeah, so we're talking about a connection to the land.
Thousands of years old.
Thousands of years old. And they're sometimes described as indigenous to the region.
It makes you think about how we define indigeneity
It does.
and how it plays out in these historical narratives.
Absolutely.
So before all of this modern nationalism, the term Palestinian was a lot broader.
It was.
It was basically anyone who lived in the region.
Regardless of background. It was a geographical term more than a national one.
I see.
But then during the British Mandate,
Mm-hmm.
we get a legal definition.
Okay.
Anyone who's the citizen of Mandatory Palestine,
Right.
according to the 1925 Citizenship Order.
So that includes a whole mix of people.
It does. Jews, Arabs, Christians,
Right.
all sorts of communities.
But then 1948 happens.
Right.
And everything changes.
Everything changes.
The meaning of Palestinian shifts.
It becomes more focused.
Yeah, it starts to refer mainly to the Arab population who didn't become Israeli citizens.
Exactly. And their descendants.
And this shared experience of displacement,
The Nakba.
the Nakba, yeah,
The catastrophe.
really becomes central to their identity.
It's a defining moment.
And the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization,
Right.
they formalize this.
They do in their Palestinian National Covenant. They define Palestinians as Arab citizens who lived there permanently until 1947.
Whether they were expelled or remained.
Exactly. And their descendants.
So it really ties their identity to that pre-1948 connection.
Exactly.
And it's amazing how many Palestinians there are now.
Right.
Like 14.3 million as of 2022.
Spread all over the world.
Yeah, in neighboring Arab countries.
Mm-hmm.
And those refugee communities who rely on UNRWA.
It's a huge diaspora.
And despite being spread out,
Mm.
their culture and language really tie them together.
Right. They primarily speak Palestinian Arabic.
Which is related to other Levantine dialects.
Exactly.
And their cultural practices are really rooted in the history of the region.
And the vast majority are Muslim,
About 98%.
which also shapes their social fabric.
So speaking of social fabric,
Okay.
the material talks about these traditional structures.
Right.
The Bedouin tribes, the urban elite, and then the peasant hamulas.
The clans.
Yeah, these clans are fascinating.
They are.
They seem like more than just family units.
Definitely. So historically, before the 20th century,
Okay.
these were the main ways that society was organized.
Okay.
You had the Bedouin tribes,
Often nomadic.
right, nomadic or semi-nomadic,
Okay.
and they used their tribal structure for everything.
From dividing up the work
Protecting themselves.
in a tough environment.
Exactly.
Then you had the urban elite,
Based in cities.
Right.
Often integrated into the Ottoman system.
kind of like middlemen.
Yeah, intermediaries between the local population and the authorities.
Oh, I see.
But the peasant hamulas,
The clans.
they were really the backbone of rural society.
Oh, okay.
They relied on their numbers for protection.
Because central authority was weak.
Right, and they were crucial for the Musha system.
Musha.
Yeah, it's this really interesting form of communal land ownership
Okay.
where families would rotate plots of land.
So everyone had a share.
Exactly. It ensured a shared stake in the agricultural output.
That's so interesting.
It's a fascinating system.
And these clans, they're still around today.
They are,
They still have a lot of influence.
especially in the West Bank and Gaza.
It's amazing how these traditional structures persist.
It is, what's fascinating is that they can act as local power centers.
Mhm.
And their loyalties can even go beyond political parties.
So they're more powerful than political divisions.
In a way, yeah. And in disputes, they might even use traditional tribal law.
Instead of the official legal system.
Right, especially where those systems are weak or untrusted.
I see.
And they provide this sense of security for individuals and families.
When the state can't or won't.
Exactly. And while they're based on ancestry, they've actually been quite fluid historically.
Meaning people could join
Yeah, smaller groups could join larger ones,
for protection.
or for mutual benefit.
I see.
So they're not as rigid as you might think.
We also learned about how these clans managed shared lands under the Musha system.
Right.
And it's interesting how that's evolved today.
It has. They now manage shared financial well-being,
Through foundations and NGOs.
especially in Gaza.
So they're adapting to modern needs. Exactly.
And even in refugee camps, they recreate these clan identities
They do.
based on their original villages.
It's remarkable.
It shows how strong these ties are,
To both community and place.
even when they're displaced.
It's a powerful reminder of what home means.
The material also talks about these notable Palestinian families,
Right.
like the Husseinis,
The Khalidis.
the Nashashibis.
Often from urban elite backgrounds.
They had a lot of influence
They did during the Ottoman and British Mandate periods.
as intermediaries
Exact.
between the authorities and the local population.
There's a fascinating example of the Khalidi family
Okay.
holding important administrative positions within the Ottoman system.
Really?
Yeah, it shows their role as go-betweens.
And these large families still wield power today.
To do, especially in Gaza.
It's a reminder that these social structures are more than just history.
Right, they have real impact on people's lives.
And the conflict has shaped how they function.
It has, for
leading to more fluidity in clan membership. Right. People are looking for support networks.
in new environments.
Exactly. And sometimes you even see a kind of tribalization of politics.
Especially during times of instability.
Right, when central authority is weak.
So all of this is happening against the backdrop of this long-running conflict.
This conflict that's at the heart of everything.
And the material lays it out pretty clearly.
It does.
It's a clash between Zionism and Palestinian nationalism.
Two competing nationalisms.
And Zionism starts putting down roots in the late 19th century.
Yeah, with the goal of creating a Jewish state in Palestine.
And they start settling the land.
Right.
Which immediately creates tension with the Arab population.
Who are also developing their own sense of national identity.
And they're afraid of being displaced.
Absolutely.
And then you have Great Britain coming in.
And throwing fuel on the fire.
Yeah, the Balfour Declaration in 1917.
Saying they support a Jewish national home.
What a mess.
It really was a turning point.
And then they get the mandate over Palestine. It's supposed to implement the Balfour Declaration.
But also protect Arab rights.
How do you even do that?
It seems impossible.
It was a recipe for disaster.
And it definitely led to more tension and resentment.
So eventually they just give up.
Well, they hand the problem over to the UN.
Right. And that leads to the 1947 partition plan.
Which is accepted by Zionist leaders.
But rejected by Palestinians and Arab states.
And that rejection leads directly to the 1948 Arab-Israeli War.
And the intervention of neighboring Arab countries.
Which changes everything.
Really reshapes the map.
It does. And since then, international actors have been trying to find a solution.
With limited success.
Yeah, there's a general consensus for a two-state solution.
Based on the 1967 borders.
Right.
And a just resolution for the refugees.
But the U.S. and Israel haven't really been on board with that since the 1980s.
And then you have all these other conflicts.
Yeah.
The Suez Crisis.
The Six-Day War.
The Yom Kippur War.
The First and Second Intifadas.
And the ongoing conflicts in Gaza.
It's just this cycle of violence.
That seems to never end.
Each event just makes things more complicated.
And it reinforces all those unresolved issues.
Like the occupation.
The status of Jerusalem.
The settlements.
The borders of a future Palestinian state.
The right of return.
Israel's security concerns.
Water resources.
It's like a tangled knot.
It is. There are so many layers.
And the impact of the occupation on Palestinians is huge.
It is. They face restrictions on movement.
The separation barrier divides communities.
And the settlements keep expanding.
Which makes a contiguous Palestinian state almost impossible.
Right.
And there are serious human rights concerns.
Some people even call it apartheid.
And then you have Hamas.
Right. A militant group in Gaza.
Which rejects Israel's right to exist.
And has engaged in armed conflict.
And the Palestinian movement itself is divided.
Between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority.
Which weakens their position.
It does make it harder to present a unified front.
So, on top of everything else, you have this internal division.
It's another layer of complexity.
And at the heart of it all are these fundamentally different narratives.
Right.
Palestinians talk about their historical connection to the land.
The injustice of the Nakba.
And the right of return.
While Israelis emphasize their own historical ties.
The need for a secure homeland.
And they see Palestinian militancy as terrorism.
And the right of return as a threat.
And they often view the settlements and the separation barrier very differently.
Than the rest of the world.
Right. International law generally sees the settlements as illegal.
But that doesn't change Israeli perspectives.
No. It does.
So it's like these two completely different realities.
And it makes finding common ground incredibly difficult.
So we've covered a lot.
We have.
The history of a name.
The evolution of an identity.
The strength of these social structures.
And the deeply rooted reasons for this conflict.
It's clear that understanding all of this
is crucial for making sense of what's happening.
In the region we know as Palestine.
Absolutely.
So we've given you a lot to think about. But here's one final question to leave you with.
Okay.
Given all of this history.
The displacement.
The competing claims.
The security concerns.
How can we ever find a path forward?
That works for everyone.
That brings peace and justice.
To this land that's been contested for so long?
It's a tough question.
It is.
But it's one that we all need to grapple with.
If we want to see a better future.
For Palestinians.
And for Israelis.
And for the region as a whole.
It's a challenge worth facing.